It's 1986 and the Japanese have planned another invasion. This time it's Sega, and they even have Europe in their sights. Intel released the 386 chip, so PC gaming is just about to get exciting. And in the UK, page 3 models, well, they're becoming pop icons, and if you don't know what they are, you want to Google that yourself. My name's Stuart, this is Generation Pixel, and welcome to the Pixel Years. Breaking news in 1986, Great Britain and continental Europe are set to get one step closer as the United Kingdom and France unveil plans for a channel tunnel. The ever popular ZX Spectrum computer brand is bought by Alan Sugar, bringing it into the Amstrad family. Well, it could have been worse, it could have been Commodore. And finally, the Sun newspaper reports that popular UK comedian Freddie Starr ate a live hamster, and there will be definitely more on that subject as the years roll on. So hello friends, and welcome back to the Pixel Years, and here we are in 1986, and let me tell you, it's just as good a year as 1985. But we're here to start with the games, and the first game I'm going to talk about today is Paperboy. Now, it's not likely that I'll be able to tell you anything about Paperboy that you don't already know. Well, not unless you've stumbled upon this video and were born this side of the millennium. And even saying that, Paperboy is one of those games that has stamped itself on the pop culture consciousness, so even today's generation still have a little understanding about the wonderful game Paperboy. Now, Paperboy of course was released in the arcades back in 1985, the year before it was released on the ZX Spectrum, and of course it was going to get a port to the home systems after being such a smash in the arcades. But what gets me every time is another one of those mundane job games. We've seen Trashman previously, and we've also went to school in a video game, but Paperboy, that was taking it to another level, because being a paperboy was one of the jobs you were likely to have in the 80s so that you could afford to save up and buy Paperboy the video game. But of course, being an actual paperboy is nothing like playing it in a game, and that's what this is all about, the game. A wonderful example of mid-80s arcade game where it's all about getting high scores and having lightning reflexes, and Paperboy doesn't let down on any of these counts. Now, as you can clearly see, the ZX Spectrum port isn't quite as colourful as the arcade version. Well, it wasn't going to be, because the arcades had much more going on under the hood than the ZX Spectrum did. But taking into consideration the limitations of the ZX Spectrum, they managed to get Paperboy spot on. Just about everything that you could want from the arcade version was in the ZX Spectrum port. Well, obviously we didn't have the handlebar joystick, but that would have been a big ask on the ZX Spectrum. But gameplay, graphics, replayability, it's all there. So if you're interested in taking a stroll down memory lane, then Paperboy on the ZX Spectrum is one game that you can't go far wrong with, and definitely one that I played to death back in the 1980s on both the arcade and the ZX Spectrum. And the biggest compliment yet, I still play Paperboy today, despite the well-known fact that I'm an absolute RPG junkie that rarely ever dips back into his arcade roots.
Jake Rockwell, Ace McCloud, and Doc Terror each sold separately.
Trouble and Forever, Jake! And assault mode! Let's do it! I name this Doc Terror down! Centurions! Take this! Energize the power mode! Bombs away! Fire! Now it's Doc Terror falls! Right, Jake? Right, Ace!
New Centurions, Jake Rockwell, Ace McCloud, and Doc Terror come as shown, each sold separately.
Next up for the ZX Spectrum games that captivated my attention back in 1986, we have the Sacred Armour of Interiat. So unlike Paperboy, a game where just about everyone on the planet who has access to some sort of video game technology has managed to play it, Sacred Armour of Interiad, which I'm now going just to refer to as Interiad because the full title's just too much of a mouthful, is a game that not many people have played. Yes, there will be people out there who have experienced this absolute gem of a game, but not enough. Now, for all you experienced gamers out there watching this particular video, I want you to pay attention to how this game plays. You start with your hero, you move through a maze of platforms, and during the gameplay you have to find power-ups and special items to help you progress from level to level. And also, this is all happening in 1986. So everyone out there with just a little bit of gaming knowledge might be putting 2 and 2 together here and coming up with the conclusion that you are now watching a lost Metroidvania. Interiad, a game that came out at the same time as Metroid and Castlevania, made completely independently from those two games, as each of those two games were amongst themselves, yet having those almost identical gameplay mechanics. Now of course Metroid and Castlevania had the luxury of being on the NES. That meant there was going to get much more exposure than a ZX Spectrum game. But it truly is a crying shame that this particular game didn't make it to the same dizzy heights, because without a doubt it's one of the best looking games in the Spectrum with some of the most interesting gameplay. Well, of course it was going to be interesting gameplay if it was a Metroidvania. Where it stands out the most for me, despite the stellar gameplay, is in the graphics. The sprite work is fantastic. They're so big, they're so well detailed and so beautifully animated. Well, at least your main character is, and that's the important one. The backgrounds are interesting and colourful, and the enemy sprites are varied and frustrating in their patterns at times. And then there's the story, and don't let me get started on the story, because to truly appreciate it, you need to read the included graphic novel that came with this game. So if you are a fan of video games, and especially video game history, then Antiriad is a must play, because this is a game that is truly as innovative as Castlevania and Metroid. Because it came out at the same time, it just didn't get the exposure.
This is the new shape, the new design, the new dimension of interactive video entertainment that actually accepts both cartridge and card software, releasing new worlds of sight, sound, and power for you. The Sega Master System of Entertainment.
Next up for the games, and again still from the ZX Spectrum, I present 180. Now, sports games have never really been my number one go-to when it comes to video games, and one of the few exceptions of me not playing sports games is, well, golf games. I do like a good golf game, and I have done since, well, a long time, but that's for another year. Now, this particular game, as you can see, is definitely not golf, it is darts. Now, there had been dart games before 180, and of course there were games after it as well, but 180 was just the pinnacle of the genre, the dart game genre. Most dart games back in the day had very clumsy mechanics and it became too easy. The beauty of 180 was, well, you played as a disembodied hand. Your own hand, you're playing darts in first person. Now, your disembodied hand could only move in diagonals, which was the first level of difficulty you had to overcome. It wasn't just a case of moving up, down, left and right, you had to work out the diagonal path. And the hand was in constant motion, so it wasn't like you could just aim at the board where you wanted to and then fire. You had to almost float the hand to the position that you wanted it to be in. And not only the motion of the hand, but the motion of the fingers. You will notice that the dart tip moves up and down as the hand floats across the screen, and where the point of that dart is just as important as the position of the hand. This game was an exceptional piece of programming back in 1986. Now, of course, there were some other things that I quite liked about the game as well. There's that good old fashioned quirky 80s ZX Spectrum humour in the game. Your opponents, as you'll notice, are just a little bit odd. When it's not your turn and you're watching your opponent play, you'll see the barmaid slide you a pint, or occasionally a dog walks across, cocks his leg and urinates just where you're sitting. And that's not to mention the speech in the game, because if you do manage to score 180, which for anyone who doesn't know darts is the highest score you can achieve on a dartboard, then you get the commentator in the game calling out 180. Now, it doesn't quite sound as good as that. This is what it sounds like. 180! But you know what? That was good enough for me in 1986, sitting in front of my little CRT playing a game of virtual darts. Next up, and still on the ZX Spectrum because we're still stuck in the 80s, I give you Rebel Star. Now I'm going to apologise straight off the bat because there won't be a lot of action on screen, not with Rebel Star, and that's quite simply because Rebel Star isn't a high action arcade game, it's a turn-based tactics shooter. Nonetheless, it was an indication and an early indication of where my personal gaming preferences were going to lead, and lead quite soon. Now there are a couple of interesting facts about Rebel Star, and the first one being that it's a remake, or a remaster anyway. And not only was it the first remake or remaster that I had ever personally played, it was probably the first one that was ever made, at least as far as I can think back. The original game was Rebel Star Raiders, a game written entirely in BASIC, but after seeing the popularity of the game they went back to the drawing boards, reworked it all back into machine code and gave us Rebel Star. And the other interesting fact, well, what you're looking at here is probably the granddaddy of tactical turn-based shooting games. And if you want a few modern examples of that, well, just think XCOM or Gears Tactics. Now strangely that's not a genre that I personally stayed with, but when Rebel Star came out there was nothing quite like it and it totally captivated me. Now of course you can play against the CPU, the central processing unit in your ZX Spectrum, and that does give you a fun and interesting little experience, but where the true beauty in Rebel Star lay was in the fact that it was also two-player, which meant that you could pit your tactical knowledge and skills against your very best friend. And let me tell you, back in 1986, and for a couple of years after that too, this was a very common battle between me and my best friend Dario. It also employed a few other interesting traits that were quite prevalent back then in 1986, such as it having a lot of Star Wars reference to it. You might take a look at some of the sprites on the screen and see that the droids look a bit like R2 units, and of course you had the option of having a lightsaber type weapon if you ran out of ammo with your photon blaster or laser rifle, because in 1986 there was no downside to referencing Star Wars in whatever you were doing at the time. And the game itself had a lot of depth, it was something that you wanted to play and get better at. And if you are a fan of the modern day games such as XCOM, then definitely you should take a look at Rebel Star, see where it all started, and have that sense of wonder that way back in 1986 they could come up with a concept as solid as Rebel Star.
Just how hot is your chili? Fairly hot.
Extra heavy-duty Rough Riders from Lee. We've been building them that good since 1889.
It's the final countdown. This is a kind of magic.
Mama, come on, baby, tell me what's the word. Word up.
This is the touch me, I wanna feel your body.
But wasting time, always searching for those wasted years.
The last game from the ZX Spectrum we're going to be looking at this year is the mighty Uridium. Now despite being the JRP junkie that I am these days, back in the 1980s and deep into the 1990s as well, I still did have a passion for arcade action, and in 1986 it was all about shoot 'em ups, or shmups as the kids call them these days. And the one that captivated the absolute most time that I would play on the ZX Spectrum back in 1986 was Uridium. Now I don't recall ever having a preference over horizontal and vertical shooters, but looking back now with hindsight I can see that I tended to gravitate towards horizontal shooters. Now that being said, I don't have any justification as to why the horizontal shooters were more attractive to me, it just seems to be the case. and perhaps if anything they were just maybe a little bit more prevalent in the 1980s. And by the time that the vertical shooters and the bullet hell games were really starting to take hold, I was definitely off on a more tactical and turn-based gaming journey. But enough of that. Uridium, why Uridium? We'll just take a look at it. It's absolutely stunning on the ZX Spectrum. And not only that, it controls like a dream. It's absolutely buttery smooth, and it really has to be at the pace that you play this game at. Not that you have to play it fast, because the mechanic in this game is that you can accelerate and decelerate and then flip round and turn in reverse and go the opposite direction. And that was the unique selling point that drew me into Uridium. There were other horizontal shooters out there, but most of them had you at a static pace. Yes, you could maybe move forward and backwards on the playing screen, but to actually be able to accelerate, decelerate and then go into reverse, that was the bomb back then. And not only that, you could flip your ship onto its side and navigate through tighter passages. And the stages were so well designed and laid out, it made it an absolute joy to play. Not easy by any stretch of the imagination, but when you put the time and effort into Uridium and you started reaping the rewards of that practice, you almost felt like the last starfighter yourself. You know, a film that came out quite recently, well, in 1986 anyway. So without a doubt, if you're looking to play a shoot 'em up on the ZX Spectrum, Uridium should be high on your list. So there you go my friends, that's 1986 in a nutshell, and why don't you let me know if you've experienced any of these things yourself, if you've played the games, listened to the music or watched the movies, then drop that down in the comments, because the interaction between you and me is what makes this whole series special. Thank you again for watching, and until, well, 1987, cheerio!
Time Dad was up. Dad must have had a good day off.
Kellogg's Rice Krispies, the only ones with snap, crackle and pop.